Hi, this is Chris Smith with Local Joe's. At Local Joe's, we help local business. Hi, this is Chris Smith with Local Joe's.
This is City Pulse Newsmakers, a weekly look at the issues and the people behind them in Greater Lansing. Brought to you by City Pulse, Lansing's weekly alternative newspaper. And now, here's your host, City Pulse publisher, Burl Schwartz.
Good morning. My guest today is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist and the author of a number of books, including political biographies and sports biographies, and now a look back at our state's most important city. It is once in a great city, a Detroit story, and I'm pleased to welcome DavidMaraniss.
Thanks, Barrow. Great to be with you.
Thank you. David, I'd like to get to know you a little bit before
Sure.
we talk about the book. I know you were born in Detroit, but not raised there, not for very long.
Right.
Tell me your bio.
Well, I was born in Detroit in 1949 at Women's Hospital. My father was working at the Detroit Times. I lived there until I was about 7 on Dexter on the west side, about a mile up from the Fisher Y and West Grand Boulevard. And my earliest memories are of Detroit, of course, the Bob Lowe Boat and Hudson's Department Store and Verner's Ginger Ale and Briggs Stadium, the Tigers, and taking the bus down Dexter to the Fisher Y and having to swim naked with other 6-year-old boys in the freezing pool. Those are my early memories of Detroit. My father, after that, the Detroit Times folded. He ended up in Madison, Wisconsin, where I spent the rest of my childhood and university years in Madison.
So, University of Wisconsin grad.
Yes, and just last year I got an honorary degree at Wisconsin, which was nice.
That's exciting.
But met my wife in high school. We got married when we were 20 years old, just barely. The odds were against it, but we've been married for 46 years. So Madison was so idyllic that I realized we had to leave. Otherwise, we'd just be stuck there our whole lives.
Yeah.
So I got on a train and went out to the East Coast.
That dates you alone. You got on a train.
Yeah, went out to the East Coast and applied for jobs everywhere and got hired by the Trenton Times.
Yeah.
And at that point, it was the Post Farm Club. And in 2 years, I was at the Post. So I got to the Washington Post in 1977. And I've been there ever since. I'm not an institutional type of person, but I'm very loyal, and I've stayed there the whole time, and I've survived largely because I'm not there very often. For 8 years, I was the Southwest Bureau Chief in Austin, Texas. And starting, mostly I've written about sociology and politics for the Post. I'm not a political animal. I don't really care about the day-to-day trivia of politics, but I love to explore why people are the way they are and the forces that shape them. And so over the course of many campaigns and years, I became sort of the biographer for the Post of political candidates. And that's how I got to my first book, which was a biography of Bill Clinton. I covered him in '92.
And that's what you won your
the
Pulitzer.
Right, for the stories about him during the campaign, about his life. And woke up the day after that election in a hellhole motel in Little Rock, Arkansas, and said, "Okay, I'm ready. I want to do this book. I think I understand him as well as anyone else. I'd regret it if somebody else wrote the book and I didn't." Mm-hmm. And I just felt prepared, and so that was the beginning of my first book, first in this class, and this book is my 11th. So over the course of those 23 years, I've still been affiliated with the Post, but it's been very, very generous in terms of my relationship with it. Some years I'm more active than others, and they let me write books.
If you were writing a political biography of anyone in this current campaign, is there anyone who you think is interesting enough?
You know, this will perhaps give some things away, but I have to be obsessed to write a book. And it has to be either a theme or a person that I can live with for 3 or 4 years. I'm not sure there's anyone there, honestly. I can't write about anybody that I don't admire in some way. Bill Clinton was difficult because he's such a contradictory figure. So there were times when I was writing about him that I really didn't like him at all, and other times when I respected him for what, in the course of his life, what he was doing at that point. But there was enough there, and there were enough other threads in that book that it kept me interested. I've written a lot about Hillary. I don't want to write a book about her. Some of the Republican candidates are interesting, but I don't think I want to devote 3 or 4 years of my life to them. I actually did write a small book with my colleague Michael Weisskopf in 1995 about the Republican Revolution, and John Kasich was a major character in that book, and he's a pretty interesting guy.
You say you have to be obsessed to write a book. So what was the obsession with Detroit?
Beryl, it came at the strangest way. I was watching the Super Bowl in 2011 in New York City in a bar in Midtown Manhattan with the cast of a Broadway play that was inspired by my Lombardi book, which was kind of surreal because the Packers were playing,
Right.
Lombardi was the Packer coach in the 60s. And at halftime, I saw the first Chrysler commercial imported from Detroit. And first the freeway sign caught my attention, and then the Joe Louis fist, and then the Diego Rivera murals of Detroit industry, and Eminem driving through the streets of Detroit. And by the time it was over, by the time he'd walked into the Fox Theater with this black gospel choir rising in song, and turned to the camera and said, "This is the Motor City, and this is what we do," I was choked up. I wasn't expecting it, and so it made me start thinking, why? What did that? Well, Detroit meant something deep to me, and then I started thinking, well, what can I do about that? Well, I'm a writer. I'll write. What can I write? And that was the beginning of the process. Detroit in 2011 was in a pretty difficult situation. It had gone through decades of decline. And I'm not a financial writer. I knew that that aspect of its decline was interesting, but someone else can write its bankruptcy and all of that. I wanted to try to write about what Detroit gave America and show the shadows of its difficulties at the same time. And that's what led me to this specific period. I sort of always have used the metaphor for my writing: set up an oil rig somewhere and drill as deeply as you can.
That's wonderful. The period you're talking about is roughly 62 to 64.
Yeah, it's 18 months. It starts in October of 1962 with the Detroit Auto Show, which unveiled the 63 cars that sold more than any before that, and also the beginning of the creation of the Mustang during that period. And at the same week as the auto show, Berry Gordy's Hitsville, USA Motown went off on their first Motortown review, taking that wonderful music to the nation. It goes through that. There are 4 threads of the book, and that's how I narrowed it down to that period. It's cars, Motown, labor, United Auto Workers, and Walter Reuther, and civil rights. And Detroit played an important role in all 4 of those, and that's what I wanted to show.
And those are the 4 that I thought were the theme, so you got them across. One of the things I found fascinating was the chapter or so about Reuther and Henry Ford II, and I didn't know that much about Henry Ford II, other than he was a glamorous son of the founder. But he actually seemed like a pretty enlightened guy.
That surprised me too. I didn't know much about Henry Ford II either, the Deuce as they called him. But he had to he had to overcome a lot of his grandfather's prejudices. First of all, Henry Ford, the founder of Ford Motor Company, perhaps was a brilliant, innovative marketer of cars, but he was a horrible anti-Semite, and his Ford Motor Company was viciously anti-union. And his grandson, Henry Ford II, the son of Edsel Ford, who was the founder's son. So this is the grandson.
And who died early.
Fairly early, and is kind of a neglected figure in the history, too. Who was a much better figure than his father. But anyway, Henry Ford II worked very hard to overcome the anti-Semitism stigma that Ford Motor Company had, and also had a fairly rational relationship with Walter Reuther and United Auto Workers. He certainly didn't love him politically, but he wasn't viciously anti-union and realized that they had to get along and work together, and so really helped repair that the horrible relationship that at one point included Ford Motor Company goons beating up Walter Reuther outside of the River Rouge plant.
Reuther comes across to me as one of the real heroes of Detroit at that time.
Yeah, I think so. I consider Reuther one of the under-recognized major figures in American social history in the 20th century. And certainly important to Detroit, but also to the nation. You know, and it wasn't just that the United Auto Workers in many ways helped, because there were so many workers in the auto plants, helped bring that working class into the middle class. He did that. He also was fairly prescient in terms of seeing the effects of technology. You know, he couldn't stop it, but he really saw how it would affect his industry and all working people over the next 50 years. And he was very progressive on civil rights.
He had a crazy idea that might have worked about small cars.
Yeah, he did. In 1963, he proposed that Studebaker was just closing its plant in South Bend. That whole auto company was going under. And he proposed that the big three, just as they worked together during World War II, work together again, cooperate and build a smaller car that could, you know, be less expensive and for the working class of this country. And he was so influential in Washington in terms of the UAW's connection to democratic politics that Lyndon Johnson, when he was president in early '64, was trying to persuade Robert McNamara, his defense secretary, to encourage this development of this small car that Walter Reuther proposed. It didn't go anywhere, but it showed Reuther's foresightedness.
And it reminded me of hearing of former Governor Milliken of Michigan. I asked him about, did anybody really see the downfall of Detroit coming because of smaller cars? And he said, no, we were just oblivious to it, but Walter Reuther saw it.
He did see it. And no, in '63, when they were selling more cars than ever, they also were selling cars with more aluminum and chrome than ever before.
Right.
There had been this very brief window of compact cars in '59 and '60, and it looked like it could be going in that direction, but then the economy improved again and they went back up to the big cars. And they did not see Japan at all. In '63, Japan was not a presence. Volkswagen was a minor presence. And so they saw Germany as a possible threat. But everything that was to come was basically disregarded. And that's one of the tensions in my book is, you know, we all know what was coming after that. But during that period, the characters in the book don't know, and some of them should have. The ones who did have some foresight include not only Walter Reuther, but some sociologists at Wayne State University who, in '63, put out a report that said Detroit's losing 500,000 people by the end of this decade, and that trend will continue for the foreseeable future, which sadly was true.
Yeah, if ever there was a city that should have regionalized, it is Detroit, because there is so much money in the Detroit suburbs still today.
It's so true, yeah. Just yesterday I was out in Novi, and that whole area is booming, and you know, all around there's a lot of wealth. So when people, and those people call themselves Detroiters, you know, so my response to them is, well, if you call yourselves Detroiters, care about Detroit.
Right. exactly. Race, of course, is one of the major themes, and the juxtaposition of Martin Luther King and Malcolm X is fascinating, and a lot of that played out in Detroit.
Yeah, it really did. What I call the center pole of my book is the Walk to Freedom in Detroit in June 23rd, 1963. It was Aretha Franklin's father, the preacher, Reverend C.L. Franklin, who invited King to Detroit. King had visited Detroit many times. It was very important to the Southern civil rights movement. A lot of the money came from Detroit. Both the United Auto Workers and the NAACP and others brought money to support the civil rights movement. King arrived in Detroit right after Medgar Evers had been assassinated, and only a few months after the Birmingham protests, where there were police dogs and hoses were sicked on the demonstrators. The progressive police commissioner of Detroit then, George Edwards, greeted King at the airport with sort of these resonant words, "You'll find no police dogs here." He was welcomed into town, led what was then the largest civil rights rally in American history down Woodward Avenue to Cobo Hall, where he delivered the first large public iteration of his I Have a Dream speech in Detroit first. Malcolm X, and then of course 2 months later he said it again in Washington, the March on Washington. And Malcolm X, who one of his nicknames was Detroit Red, he'd grown up near here, near Lansing. Malcolm X had much of his childhood, and then came to Detroit after he got out of prison in Massachusetts. His brother Wilfred X ran the Islamic Nation of Islam temple in Detroit, and Malcolm X disparaged the March on Washington, said that King was sort of the puppet of white liberals, and came to Detroit a few months later in November and delivered maybe the most famous, or most important speech of his career, the message from the grassroots in Detroit, sort of articulating a Black Power perspective. And that separation in the civil rights movement was just beginning then in '63, and you could see it all play out in Detroit.
Yeah, and as you know, because you say so in your book, Malcolm X actually grew up in Lansing, and the greater Lansing area.
Absolutely, yeah.
The role of Motown is it's a theme throughout the book, and it made me wonder if you're a frustrated music writer.
I can't claim there's a lot of music in my family. My little sister was a classical pianist, but I can't make that claim. I admire great music writers. I'm not Peter Guralnick, but I do love music, and I usually write in silence. But in this book, I had the soundtrack of Motown blaring in my office the whole time.
The show?
Yeah. No, I have the whole, every Motown record ever cut.
No
I've got the box set, so yeah, it was great fun.
Yeah.
I mean, it's really Motown. Some real music aficionados disparage it as sort of assembly line pop music to some extent. And I try to present a different, an alternative take on it in the book, which really is that some of the music companies that were considered more authentically black were controlled by whites, and this was run by African Americans, by the Berry Gordy family. Not just Berry Gordy Jr., but his sisters played an important role in it too. But just think about that first bus that left West Grand Boulevard in October of 1962 with little Stevie Wonder, age 13,
right.
Marvin Gaye.
Who went to school here, by the way, the School for the Blind.
Yes, that's right. And Marvin Gaye and Mary Wells and Martha and the Vandellas and Smokey Robinson and the Miracles, the Temptations singing backup, and the Supremes the opening act, and nobody was sure if they would make it or not. Just an incredible collection of talent.
And your story is rich with anecdotes, one of which was Stevie Wonder flying back from Europe to be on the Ed Sullivan Show. And you think today, how could time run out and they didn't get Stevie Wonder on? But of course,
it happened, yes.
That was amazing. Barry Gordy was an interesting figure because he didn't waste a lot of time supporting civil rights. He actually just went out and did it.
Yeah, he was not. That's right. He was not an activist like some other black entertainers were in that period, but by the pure entrepreneurship of Motown, he was making a statement, and he also did some things. I mean, he recorded that first version of "I Have a Dream" that King delivered in Detroit. Barry Gordy recorded it as a spoken word record, and he also recorded Langston Hughes and many other cultural black figures of that era. So he was trying to do more than just music in that sense. The irony of him recording the I Have a Dream speech is that that recording was unveiled on August 28th, 1963, completely overshadowed by what was happening in Washington.
And couldn't work it out then to...
No, there was some... You're right. I'm sorry to interrupt. There was some dispute between the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, King's organization, and Motown about royalties. But
right.
That's part of life. Everybody's always fighting over royalties.
Well, the politicians of that time, when you think now what a minor figure the mayor of Detroit is in politics today, but Jerome Cravenagh had a brilliant future. And what happened to him?
He sure seemed to. He was elected in '61, an upset election, and it was largely the African-American vote that got him into office. There'd been so much tension between the police and the African-American community in Detroit before that, and the mayor, Louis Mariani, was sort of considered the symbol of the police crackdown on blacks. And Cavanaugh, over the course of his first few years, really became America's mayor. He was on the cover of Time magazine. He became the head of the Conference of Mayors and the League of Cities, and he was running all of these programs that were part of the Great Society. And then it all fell apart. And you can actually see it starting to fall apart in the period of my book. A month after the Walk to Freedom, a black prostitute was shot in the back on John R. by two cops. And it was sort of an upsurge of events, much like Ferguson, Missouri, sadly 50 years later. But the tensions came back into it. The police commissioner, Edwards, the progressive, left to take a federal judgeship. And things started to deteriorate in the city. And then by 1967, the riots came. One of the counterfactual questions I raised in the book, which I knew nothing about until I started researching it, was, what if Detroit had won the 1968 Olympic bid?
I was going to ask you about that.
I mean, they were that decision was made in '63 during this period, and Detroit had been the U.S. nominee 4 times before. It had a surprisingly strong connection to the International Olympic Committee movement, and it thought it was the favorite to win those '68 Olympics. And Cavanaugh was a major part of that effort, as was George Romney, the governor, Mitt Romney's dad. And they went to Baden-Baden, West Germany, and really thought they were going to get the Olympics. They didn't for a lot of reasons, but mostly it had to do with geopolitics and the rise of the third world and Mexico
Went to
City.
Mexico City.
But think about if they had gotten it. So what would have happened? Would the sensibility of the leaders of Detroit been different, more aware of things that were bubbling up to have prevented the '67 riots, which would have been devastating if the Olympics were coming a year later? Maybe they could have. Maybe they would have taken steps.
So is that why you included that?
Yeah, it is. And also, it was a way to bring in the sort of the political power structure of Detroit, and it also had a racial connection as well, because at that very same time, the Detroit City Council was defeating a public housing ordinance, and there was so much animosity in parts of the black community against that defeat that they were protesting the Olympic bid. So it connected all of those together.
It's shocking to me to read about how racist Detroit was. It was, after all, 30% black, I think, in that period.
Yes.
And but the first black city councilman hadn't been elected till 57, and then the housing ordinance failed 7-2. I mean, I guess as I look back on that period, maybe that's how it was everywhere, but it somehow seems shocking in a city with such a strong black population.
You know, it surprised me too. I had a little inkling of awareness of it because my parents met at the University of Michigan, and when my father was in the Army, my mother worked at one of the defense plants in Detroit. She was kind of a Rosie Riveter type. Mm-hmm. And she had told a few stories about the race riot of 1943 because she was living in Detroit then. And that was a really bad riot over housing and jobs in Detroit between African Americans who came up to work in the defense plants and a lot of Appalachian whites who also came up. And there was enormous tension in Detroit. So I was somewhat aware of a history of racial difficulties in Detroit, but I didn't, like you, I didn't realize how prevalent it was over the course of all those decades leading up to the conflagration of 1967.
One of your anecdotes was about the very powerful editor of the Detroit News. It's hard to believe today, but as you tell it, they literally stopped George Romney from running for president. The Detroit News and Martin
Yes.
Hayden. It's hard to imagine today that anybody would much care about what a newspaper thinks.
No, isn't that true? Yeah, Martin Hayden was, I never met him, but he seemed like he was an interesting character. And the Detroit Times was kind of the voice of the Republican
Detroit News.
Detroit News, voice of the Republican establishment. And so in 63, Romney was making some noises about running for president in 64. But he'd just been elected, and he promised that he would serve out his full term. And Martin Hayden said, basically editorials that, this is not going to happen.
Yeah.
And it didn't. He backed off immediately. Martin Hayden also was, he was a muckety-muck. He went to West Germany with the Olympic delegation, was part of that effort to get the Olympics. He had a surprising relationship with George Edwards, the police commissioner, who feared for his life because they were going after the mob in that period pretty heavily. And Edwards had been threatened. And so he wrote some letters, gave one to Martin Hayden and one to Bobby Kennedy in Washington about everything he knew in case something happened to him. And years later, whether it's connected or not, we're not sure. But a box arrived at the Detroit News. Oof, can you imagine that? Secretary brings it up to his office, and it's a severed head.
Yeah, severed. Do they ever know whose it was or where it came from?
They think it came from the morgue.
From the morgue.
Yes.
And the message was.
It's
like The Godfather.
Yeah, exactly. It wasn't a horse head; it was a human head.
Okay. Well, David Maraniss, it's really been a pleasure meeting you, talking to you, and congratulations on a wonderful book.
Thanks so much.
And this should find a place on to the Michigan portion of your in your library. Thanks for watching. We'll be back next week.